Hello and welcome back to Crew Parley, the inverted version of the Q&A call and response thing we usually do in this channel, where people submit a prompt and then I respond. In Crew Parley, I submit the prompt and then you all respond. And this time, for March, I guess I would say, I submitted a prompt for janky game mechanics. Pretty simple. I said, ever see a mechanic in a game that's cool, weird, bad but in an interesting way, a terrible fit for the game but has potential, etc. I'm sure you have. Not sure I've seen many game mechanics that don't fit that description. Hit me with one of your favorites, or perhaps a few if they're small or related. I'll try to brainstorm how they could be better, too. Fire away. And fire you did. We begin immediately with Mr. Food. True Parlay Grandmaster Food presents Pollution, the pollution mechanic in Humankind. Humankind is a 4X strategy game, a genre I have difficulty describing, so you could Wikipedia deep dive that one if you want, and one of my favorite Buildcraft pastimes. Starting in the middle of the 5th out of 6 ages, Humankind introduces pollution, so late in the game, I guess. Some infrastructure upgrades to your civilization add pollution to your existing and newly built districts, especially those related to industry. This has two consequences: local pollution and global pollution. Local pollution is calculated on a per region basis, and if it reaches thresholds, it will lessen the efficiency of all districts in that region. You have a couple of ways to combat that. First of all, you could skip those industry upgrades. Second, you could spend some industry and space to construct nature reserves or plant forests to lessen pollution. And third, you could unlock some 6th era technologies to lessen the effects of pollution. Later on, probably once you've dealt with it for a while, I would imagine. And then there is the global pollution. The local pollution of every region on the map is added up each turn, and that increases the global pollution counter. If that counter reaches certain thresholds, every player gets affected by unremovable and impactful debuffs. If the counter reaches a set amount, it triggers the end of the game. That is a really cool idea for a civilization type game. It involves many systems from tech to district planning, from culture choice to diplomacy. And this will be a pattern that a lot of the submissions for this Crew Parlay had. It sounds kind of nice. Kind of. But sadly, Mr. Food continues, it's pointless. I will name some of the reasons. Number 1. The optimal way to build districts due to a set of factors is on the borders of regions. This, combined with the fixed thresholds, means that it's easy to stay below the pollution thresholds in any given region. Oh, using a sort of pollution gerrymandering? Is that what's going on here? Not exactly redrawing the borders, but not gerrymandering exactly, but if you build your district on the border of a region and then you just like build something that would pollute that region too much a few feet to the left, and then it'll be in another region, then you won't go over the threshold in this region without meaningfully separating the buildings that you built. Oh no, yeah, right. A sort of reverse gerrymandering of pollution. Oh dear. If you get above thresholds 1 or 2, nature reserves are usually enough to get you back to a state without consequences. It's easy enough to go below a certain threshold. You can have a little pollution and then reverse gerrymander the rest of the pollution into another district. Okay, that's already pretty bad, actually. Okay, so it's way too easy to mitigate. What? Okay, number 2. If you've ever played a 4X game, you would know that the single most important thing in pretty much all of them is production capacity, or in other words, industry. I know there are exceptions, but there are always exceptions underlying the rule. Industry is a requirement and it can compensate for all other game elements, okay? There's a stat that is a little too good, maybe, and that's usually fine because 4X games are balanced around that. But here it makes pollution a non-factor. Getting those industry upgrades is essential to scaling your nation to the endgame. Hold up, maybe there is a political statement about history in this relation. Point number 3, no, there is none. The additional industry scaling speeds up your progress to those pollution-lowering technology that number 4 come too early. Humankind's late-game scaling is messed up to the point that you can easily unlock the pollution-lowering technologies way too easily. Some mods like ENC lessen this issue, but my point still stands. Oh, so these points combine to make something where the benefit of developing technologies, which often increase pollution, is so large that nothing outweighs that benefit, and you can simply remove the pollution. The message here seems to be No, full speed ahead. We'll be able to deal with the pollution using the miracles of tomorrow. So go ahead and forsake the earth on our way up the the chain, right? It's not like the mechanics are making some kind of political statement. That's a horrible idea. In real life, we probably won't outrace pollution before having consequences. It's probably a good idea to try to slow it down first. I'm all for we develop technology to delete the problems of yesteryear. Indeed, developing some nanomachines or superbacteria that eat plastic in the ocean. But it's also not that impossible to just like take the plastic out of the ocean. If you've ever watched those very satisfying videos, shout out to people doing that. Yeah, it's probably worth doing both. There are benefits soon enough to cleaning up that garbage that so it seems like in this game, you can absolutely steamroll through those consequences. And also, I mean, the nature of it being, these are turn-based games, and so you build a nature reserve, and I imagine something like next turn. Turn? You know what I mean? The CO2 is just kind of into the trees, and that does not, that doesn't happen that way. That fast in real life. I feel the point is obvious. Yes, this is a really, really funny way for the mechanic to be bad. And 5, the player who is ahead will usually be the one who creates the most pollution, but is the same player who is most interested in ending the game early, meaning they have the highest interest in producing pollution. Oh no! Earlier, wait a minute, scroll back up. If the global pollution reaches certain thresholds, every player gets affected by unremovable and impactful debuffs. Every player. Wait a minute, this is like it's like snowballing. The player that gets more ahead creates more pollution, which makes it harder for everyone to get ahead, which affects them the least. And then if they make even more pollution, then the game ends, which will mean they will win. What? Oh no. This doesn't make it not matter. This makes it bad. This breaks, does this not break the whole game? Like, you just can't play this game and enjoy it unless you delete pollution as a mechanic. How do you play this game and enjoy it without removing this mechanic? Mr. Food concludes, what a fun and interesting mechanic that is ruined by complex circumstances. Yeah, I'll tell you what. Some of these problems are somewhat easy to solve. Some of them are a lot more problematic and fundamental. I really don't want to talk down on the developers here. 4X games are a balancing nightmare due to the interlinked nature of every system, and they did a good job overall. Sure, and it sounds like the kind of thing where, right, you could, it's not unbalanceable or not moddable as much as like if you set rules before each match. I really don't know a lot about this genre of games. It's not something I've enjoyed in the past yet, but my familiarity with them for as it is, not very much, is that these are games where you can often set custom match settings to an extent. So a little bit like, just to give you a different example to illustrate the concept, something like Smash Ultimate. This is a case where, if the game has decided to dispense random items and you feel those are unbalanced for the way you want a contest, you can simply turn them off. And it's not really the same as modding or fixing that imbalance in the game itself. It's more like these games are flexible to the point that you can have a few different experiences with them. So maybe there's a surprisingly easy way to enjoy this game. I mean, you seem to be having fun with it, despite the fact that you've just demonstrated why this is a huge problem. So I don't want to create a problem where there isn't one. I'm glad. There must be some way around these seemingly kind of game-ending problems. Yeah, the pollution thing is really interesting. That part actually does mirror politics in a way. It's just that if you get the pollution level too high, we all lose, and so the game ends, but you don't win. There is no win. That's sort of the problem with life if you want to look at it that way, but in a more pragmatic sense, it's about the journey, and so getting to the destination, well, that means we all die. So in a way, that is a political message. That doesn't make it a good mechanic, but that's funny. Yeah, it's interesting having the consequence be there's global pollution, but then also the local pollution. It seemed like a really clever way to make it so, I mean, it's pollution, like this is the environment, and so it affects the other players, but maybe the consequences are worse for you because it's local. And yet that's actually what the problem is. That seemingly interesting idea, it kind of is why it isn't a good idea. This is a great example of these mechanics being required to be mechanics. I have a theory that a lot of games would be improved if they were thought of outside the box of being a marketing niche, basically. And that's where a lot of these problems come from, is that the idea to kind of add something or involve a mechanic in a game sounds good, but if it sounds good, that almost means it will be bad. I have often found. Let me give you an example that's kind of different. We were talking recently, my partner and I, about the concept of games with good premises, or like adapting a property to a game, and that sounding like a good idea, but when it sounds like a good idea, that almost means it isn't a good idea to some extent. So the example that she gave was Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's something I think a lot of people would think would play well as a game, but there are some concerns. This doesn't mean that there won't be fun games about Avatar: The Last Airbender, but this situation is somewhat complicated. Bending in Avatar is doing martial arts. You do a physical thing. So it's kind of cool. It reminds me of something that iPatch Notes, you're coming later in this parlay, mentioned, where there's this game where your stamina meter is your mana. Sounds like an interesting trade-off. And that sounds like kind of what would happen in Avatar if you translated the game mechanics literally, the show mechanics literally into game mechanics. Of course, you might not translate them literally into game mechanics, but if you didn't do that, you might not get the same feel. You might make a game that says it's Avatar and is fun, but like isn't actually similar in any meaningful way. There might be a fun combat system that is balanced, but which simply isn't really similar to the combat in Avatar: The Last Airbender. Or you might get a game that has combat that really is similar to Avatar: The Last Airbender, but wouldn't actually be that fun because there would be some balance concerns. Or I think that the idea of stamina as mana thing is pretty cool. I think it's a fairly hardcore concept for a lot of people, and I doubt that that would be accessible to such a wide range appealing property like Avatar: The Last Airbender's audience. And so is it a good idea to use that marketing thing, but then make that type of maybe very interesting but possibly rather inaccessible combat system? And this is not that similar, of course. I'm just trying to illustrate this idea that sometimes the problem is that for it to be meaningful, to interpret pollution in a way that is meaningful as a mechanic, it might be very difficult to come up with a way to do that is pollution, but that doesn't then become a bad mechanic. And so I think this is meant to be sympathy as well. I agree with you, Mr. Food. This is just very difficult to balance. That kind of thing is hard to balance while making it still meaningful. It's really weird, don't you think? When these games have mechanics that are things in real life, I mean, it's not real life. It doesn't have to work the way it does in real life. It's not that it needs to be accurate, exactly. It's not exactly accurate the way it's described in this game. But there's an element of, again, for it to mean anything, and there's also an unintuitiveness if you make it work way differently than how that works in real life. That can actually make it kind of confusing, because while the player might understand they have to think differently, it's not literally physics driven in the real world pollution. They're thinking, okay, but it's related to pollution. So if it works in a way that is, just for a counterexample, directly contrary to what you expect of pollution, you get more productive when there's more pollution. Well, that won't easily work. That will take quite some explaining to kind of unbreak people's brains. And so you see what I mean? It doesn't have to work accurately to real life, but there is a way in which it has to kind of not be the way it is in real life, or it becomes very weirdly difficult to tutorialize for people because they can't latch on to their real world concept. They have to kind of forget it exists, which is bad. That's not good. So, right, it's just really difficult to balance. I think what's going to be one of the fun things about doing this crew parlay is going to be as we go through to see what the common threads for these mechanics are. And so for this one, I would say the high level things are, so the first one is that it is a mechanic that feels intuitive and seems like a fun, pretty interesting consequence to add to gameplay, right? If you're developing a big society, one of the biggest complications in doing that is pollution. One of the reasons it's interesting to talk about the perils of developing technology in the real world is that there are consequences. So for there to be consequences in the game, and then it creates the kind of push and pull that games are built on. It sounds like a very good idea. But then there are some challenges with balancing that in a way that kind of works. Again, having it affect all players, but then there's some weird incentives created, as you pointed out. It kind of benefits the player in the lead to create pollution. Whoops. And then also we have examples of, if it's localized, other game mechanics like having borders for parts of the world help make the world a reasonable simulation, but unfortunately can be kind of, I called it reverse gerrymandered to sort of abuse the local pollution mechanic. And that mechanic is not easily removable. It kind of has to be there for the game to be able to simulate having regions in a meaningful way. In real life, the way that we have regions, the way that the border between two countries, let's say, matters on a map and is like a real border, as it were, is certainly not that it is somehow a weather bubble where smog pollution only gets in this area. Of course, right? But in a video game, I mean, you have to decide some way to simulate that. And so it's, it turns out that that plays off those systems in a way that's very challenging. Again, it sounds like there's a compound problem where, for reasons unrelated to this, it was already good to build your district on the border of a region. And so it was very easy to do something that if it wasn't advantageous to build your thing on the border of a region, people probably would have considered doing, but then it would come at the drawback of building on the border of a region. But now you have to change those incentives elsewhere in the game. So there's a trickle-down effect. Yeah, something that feels kind of resonant in real life and sounds like a cool idea, but then is hard to implement in a way that sort of is the thing, pollution, but which is still a game mechanic. And I guess the final thing was that it is interlocked with a lot of other systems. Sure. Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, I'll put my cards on the table. I say, let's look for the common threads. The three examples given in the screw parlay by you folks are actually really different in my opinion. And so I don't think there will be a lot of common threads having read through them, but I mean, let's try. I don't know. Maybe there will be an unexpected one. When I wrote my show notes, I didn't find any. So let's move on, actually. So we have Just Rusty presenting. I feel like this is the exact opposite of what this parlay is asking for. No, that's fine. I mean, I don't care. As long as it's on the topic, it can be an inversion of the topic. That's not bad. I might have suggested that as a counterexample anyway. In fact, I encourage that. As long as you're not saying something that is like unrelated to the topic, it's just sort of the other side of the topic, but you're weighing in on the discussion. That's the point of why you said this. That's good. Like, not even just that's fine. Great, please do that. That I think that's good. Anyway, I actually think this is a perfect example, but a janky mechanic which I think could only work in the game it's in, and is completely incompatible with any other game I can think of. But I love it to death, and this seems like a great excuse to bring it up. So it's Hyper Demon. The game is called Hyper Demon, and it has a 360-degree vision mechanic. It's glorious. The game takes place in a tiny arena which is mostly black. It's the first-person shooter equivalent of a knife fight in a broom cupboard. All the enemies are gold, and anything which is behind you is projected in front of you in semi-transparent red. So if there's an enemy behind you here, they're projected in semi-transparent red here on the screen, I think is how it works. You posted some footage of it and I watched it. I'm sure people can find if you want to see it. Just Rusty says, I included a link to the current world record if you want to experience 1 minute and 37 seconds of mild nausea. The average player's experience will be slightly less frenetic, but it's not far off. And indeed, it was a hallucinogenic nightmare to watch with no experience with this game. That's insane. Anyway, it makes the game almost vomit-inducing to spectate if you're unfamiliar, yeah. But once acclimated, gives you the sensation of actually having eyes in the back of your head. When it clicks, it's just amazing, and there's nothing else like it. Definitely, there is this phenomenon in games that it's hard, because it makes games kind of unmarketable, I would want to say. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it makes people think, I want to try to play that. But for me, the most recent example of this was Star of Providence. This is a shoot 'em up game, a bullet hell game, where you're a little ship and you're bopping around it's very much like the shoot 'em up equivalent of a knife fight in a broom cupboard, very narrow arenas. That's a big thing about Star of Providence. You're in a tiny room, you're a little ship, and the enemies have a lot of bullets, and you dodge a lot of projectiles while kind of assassinating, is how I always think of it, the enemies in the often corners. And when you look at these games, I don't play a lot of this type of game. And so when you look at these games, your eyes go, and indeed, there's the video game donkey video promoting this game. He says this too, and I think it's a really, really important thing about this genre, something to the effect of, you look at these games and your eyes say it can't be done, but then you start to play it, and in a certain mental state, no, you really weirdly can do it, and you dodge things and go, I can't do this. That's the experience I have anyway. I'm playing it and I think, I can't do that. I just did that. I can't do that. I'm not consciously doing this. I'm semi-consciously doing this. If you have ever felt like the idea of flow was a little bit wishy-washy, play those games. I think you will quickly experience something that is not the same, in my opinion. Maybe it is physiologically, but I don't think exactly the same, but definitely illustrates the effect in a dramatic way. I really get this creeping sensation like I cannot do the thing that I'm doing. It's very strange. And so, having had that experience, looking at this footage, I believe you, Just Rusty. Like, I feel like if I pick up Hyperdemon, I don't think I can do that. I understand the mechanic, you've explained it nicely. And I looked at the footage and I thought, but I just don't get it. But there will be a kinesthetic thing that happens where you pick up the controller or whatever, almost certainly mouse and keyboard, and you will be able to do it, even though it just doesn't seem like I literally don't know what's going on, what's happening. I did notice, just as an aside, cheekily there is a training option in the menu for that game. This is kind of subgenre of arena first-person shooter with leaderboard. They're often a little sweaty, but they're really minimalist a lot of the time. So I was interested to see that this one, despite its attempt at following in the footsteps of that minimalism, includes a training mode, presumably because the developer concluded that you literally just need to include a training mode or people can't do this. So it's interesting. I mean, this is one where, yeah, I didn't really specifically say they had to be bad mechanics, but let's dig into this one a little. I mean, the pollution mechanic from Mr. Food's example, it's not really a bad idea. There are just complications. Viewing it as something that we don't pass a final verdict on, and we say, well, this individual game in the grand scheme of game design doesn't really matter. We're just interested in interesting pieces of game design, basically, that are janky, that are kind of weird, or don't feel like they would work in other games, right? Or don't work in that game, but for a very unique reason, unique to that game in some way. Then we can evaluate this the exact same way. We can say, well, obviously there's a very high upfront cost. It's almost as if when you watch a trailer of the footage of this game, you can imagine looking at it and thinking, I feel like I already know for sure that I can't do that. I think this is a problem the shoot 'em up genre often has. People often see these games and they feel like, more than most other games, they feel like they know they cannot do that before trying it. And so there's not even really a point. It looks fun. That's not really an issue. And you can understand how it might feel interesting to have had that experience. But it gives you a sort of over there feeling about those games. I think I've certainly experienced that a little. I'm just the person who, being that I do this for a living, I don't really keep that feeling on board about anything. You know, my philosophy is if other people enjoy it, there really isn't a reason I couldn't. And when we appear to have preferences, it's almost entirely just perspectives. If you can get the perspectives they had or construct your own that get you there, you will be able to enjoy the thing. There are no things you just don't like. There are only things you don't like for now until you have the perspectives required to enjoy them, or until there are no things you like. There are just things that you have the perspective to enjoy. And it's possible that some of those perspectives required to enjoy the thing are temporary. You will lose them over time. Like you haven't played one of these before, and so it's a very good beginner one, but people won't kind of continue to like it if they keep going into that genre, for example. That doesn't mean it's bad, and it doesn't mean the ones that have perspectives that you stick with are good. It's more like they're inaccessible, but inevitable. It's a strange way to think, but I find it helpful. And it's held true so far. There have been lots of games that I haven't thought I would enjoy that I did in the end. And I think this is a great example where, yeah, because I see it and think I know I can't do that, but have this mindset and have experienced that in other games, I look at this and think the fact that I think I know I can't do it means I can do it. So I instantly believe you that it is something that the body would pick up. I have detected that strange part of the brain that can sort of do these things. But definitely one flaw here is that it's something that kind of convinces the people, most people watching it, unless they're doing some crazy metagaming of their own mental state, which I wouldn't really expect of people. And it took a lot of my time and experience to have that feeling. That's not an easy perspective to acquire, the one I was just describing. It took a lot of work. I'm not sure it's worth acquiring that perspective for a lot of people. That's an expensive perspective to need for this game to seem like, oh, that looks fun, right? It doesn't seem easy to get to the point where you have that reaction. And so that's definitely a drawback. On the other hand, it seems like a very good innovation for first-person shooters. A genre I would argue is pretty famous for not innovating, and that's also an issue to some extent. I think a lot of people attracted to FPS as a format of game, often called genre, but I don't think it really is, more of a something higher than a genre, format of a game. I think are attracted to it because they have a pick up and play element to them. You play a multiplayer PvP first person shooter, and you've kind of played this before, and so you can get to grips with it and have fun, plus or minus some unique controls to give it a little twist. Titanfall 2, for example. You can get into this. There are just some new things to learn. I think that's a real strength of the genre. That's not to say they're all samey. There are plenty of examples where they have cool new mechanics, but you have kind of an into the system. A very different example of this being a, I would argue, good thing would be something like Balatro. People kind of know normal playing cards and kind of know poker hands. And so you can add a bunch of stuff on top of that and people have a place to kind of hook into it, of course. And so it's not all bad to have an FPS that has an unfamiliar mechanic, but this mechanic removes what is familiar about FPS games, I think is the main problem for a lot of people. It doesn't add a new thing that you use your point of familiarity to work through. Titanfall 2 as an example again. You can wall run and double jump. You get your butt booster pack, and you Titans. But Titans are a first person shooter as well when you operate them. So you can use the familiarity you have with the genre, format, as I'm calling it, to understand the new things. You can wall run, which gives you a new way to get away and not die when you're out in the open and you're getting shot. You know the feeling of being out in the open and getting shot from playing first-person shooters, but you have a new way to do something about that situation. And this will end up being true in Hyperdemon, I would imagine. You have had the feeling of being surrounded in a shooter and taking evasive action, but this gives you a new way to deal with that. You have the tool that you can see the enemies behind you precisely where they are. But you don't think you can. I think a lot of people, when they see this footage, they don't think they can do that. So it seems like it's actually just creating a new problem, and in many ways, maybe that's a thing. There are other concerns with this type of design. One of them in my mind is that if you have something like the format of a first-person shooter, well, players get to a high level of competency with the game pretty quickly. This makes the game easier to balance because you kind of, the way I like to think of it is you're simulating the universe of people metagaming and gaming inside of the game much faster if you have people that can kind of go with it quicker. There are some thoughts about first-person shooter tactics that take decades for people to develop sometimes without instruction, just playing them naturally. It takes they spend decades getting to the point where they think, oh, I'm going to use this tactic this way. Certain forms of recoil control come to mind, or like strafing in a certain way, or bunny hopping in some of these games. People learn these much faster, don't get me wrong, much faster, if they learn them deliberately, but it's something that people just kind of playing these games, the average people playing these games, might take a very long time to pick up. So if you already have that established perspective and you make a game that has the format of an FPS, but it's got some new elements, well, you're going to get to drill down into what is different and what you might want to balance differently, for example, about those new elements really quickly. You kind of get to advance the universe around people thinking about your game artificially fast because they've kind of played games like this before. They don't need to learn about the implications of those mechanics fully. They kind of already did that in previous games. This, though, maybe runs the risk of setting that back, basically. It's not really a disadvantage, more like the removal of one of the major advantages, potentially, or some mitigation of one of the major advantages. I don't know. There are some kinds of people who kind of learn how to learn, and I feel like maybe the best players will make this sort of a non-issue. I mean, you look at this world record speedrun that you've sent me, which should be easy to find if people want to see it. And you can imagine that this is probably somebody who plays a lot of this subgenre of these kind of arena shooter, sweaty with a leaderboard kind of game. Devil Daggers is the one I've played, which I thought was cool for what it's worth. And so maybe this isn't a big deal, but you see what I mean. It does to some extent suggest that because this is kind of uncharted territory, you're going alone a little bit. You're pioneering a thing, cool, but that's really hard. Maybe, obviously. Maybe this seems like a nothing burger of a point, but I'm just saying it might be anticlimactic to say. I still think it's a relevant point. So definitely a challenge. Let's move on to iPatchNotes' example. This is, again, pretty different from the other two. The sometimes mentioned, not parlayed MMO Toram Online, Toram. Interesting. Toram. Toram Online. Yes, you've talked about it in the stream a lot. Very strange name to me. Has the blurst isn't a word I'm familiar with, but it probably means what it sounds like, fudged, proration system. The proration system. Warframe players might call this damage attenuation. Okay, so you hit the enemy with damage types and they adapt to it, but Toram actually goes both ways. Oh? When an enemy takes one of the 3 damage types, physical, magic, and normal attacks, okay, the other damage types receive a damage increase. Oh, okay. Proration gets as low as 0.5, 50%, or still pretty high, or as high as 2.5, 250%. Interesting. So it sounds like this is a stat enemies have, or that attacks have. An enemy or an attack will suffer less from proration. It's kind of like staling in some fighting games too. Staling is the idea that if you use a mechanic, usually in a fighting game, over and over again, you do less damage with it on subsequent hits. Some games have it, some games don't. Smash is a notable series that has staling. Anyway, and so maybe some moves or maybe some enemies have this stat. The noteworthy thing to me is that without having played this, maybe I'm not abstract thinking about this right. 50% seems pretty high, and then 250% is insanely high. Like, that's crazy. Anyway, if a given solo party has the magiest mage to ever mage, they will find their damage dwindling to half. Oh, hold on, back up. So I think it's that the cap is you're doing half damage, and then you can build up the damage of other attacks to 250%. Okay, that clicked for me just in this moment. I was prepared to just be confused about that for the rest of this, but I got it on the second read through. Cool, okay. I think that makes more sense. That's probably more likely how it works. Their magiest mage to ever mage will do half damage, and they have, kind of a one-way fall to 50% damage. But adding but a single warrior, a physical damage type dealer, or including normal attacks, oh I see, like an auto attack or something, in between spells will gently massage the target's magic proration back to 100% or even over 100%. Okay, interesting. Okay, so switching up it's kind of the same goal as in fighting games. You switch up your moves, but the payoff is different. It's almost there are 2 things you can do with this system, to my mind. You can weave in variety to make attacks stronger than if you just spammed them. And this also creates potential gameplay variety. Like, that could be a more fun way to operate a character class. And you can use attacks to set up other attacks. Like, maybe this doesn't work, but the first thing I thought of was, well, there are 3 damage types. What if you weave physical and normal attacks in between each other to keep your primary damage from getting too mitigated? All the while, are you building up magic damage proration, and then you hit them with a big spike of magic damage, and you get the best of all kind of worlds. Or you daisy chain all 3 types in a more complicated way. You can imagine that increasing your overall damage by more than it would seem like. Cool. This is a little bit more like the first one. It sounds kind of good. You can smell a little bit of the problem with the first one where, okay, but it sounds really complicated, or it would have a complicated impact on the game's systems. And also a little bit of the second example where Yeah, but also I feel like some people sort of know damage attenuation. You do the same attack over and over again, it gets less effective. But the idea that it makes other attacks more effective is pretty weird. Like, that's strange. I think that's strange. Very interesting. It reminds me a little bit of how in Dead Cells, if you stack the same colored damage stat over and over again, the game knows that mathematically, if they gave you the same damage boost each time, your relative damage increase would get less and less significant, smaller compared to all the damage you have every time you got it. If you get 10% damage on top of your 100% base damage, well, you increase your damage output by 10%. But if you have 10% damage boosts, now you have 200% damage. Well, increasing your damage by another 10% only actually gives you a relative increase of 5% damage output. It gets less and less noticeable as you get more damage boosts, right? Often called diminishing returns or marginal benefit analysis, though I'm not going to make a picky distinction between those two. I think it's close enough to both ideas that it gets you in the ballpark. And games do various things about this. Dead Cells does something a little strange and actually kind of multiplies the damage you get each time so that damage mitigation or the anti-attenuation or the marginal benefit loss, whatever you want to call it, that thing is undone. So if you get, 10% boosts, then the 11th one you get would have given you only a 5% relative boost. So instead of getting 10% raw damage increase, the game gives you more, the exact amount more, that will increase your damage output by, again, I forget exactly, but like 10%. So that there isn't that mathematical phenomenon, but the game kind of shows you that. So it's sort of okay. This is why I'm sad to tell you that for this damage proration thing in Torum Online, which sounds like something that your lawyer or like bank does to make you poor, there are some burning questions. Why is the enemy's current proration not in the UI? The user interface doesn't tell you how this mechanic is going. Oh dear, it begins. Why do only some player skills state which proration they inflict? Some but not all player skills tell you how much proration effect they have. Why do some player skills have debatably cool, batshit ways of calculating proration? Sure, right, maybe some interesting ways of interacting with proration could be a cool mechanical space to explore, but not if there isn't a lack of clarity. The first point repeats, why is the enemy's current proration not in the UI? Indeed, if you can't see it, you have to get like damage meters for your own damage types to keep track of what damage you did to know how much damage you'll do. That's very weird. iPatch Notes continues, as Torum is loosely classless, players can pick up skills from weapon trees not their own. The proration system nudges players to carry diverse damage types. This sounds good, so that's one way to encourage the player to use that more. That's both a good fit for that system, and also you would actually want to get a variety of skills with this. This could be as straightforward as partying up with a player who deals different damage types than you do. However, this system comes with a lot of quirks and downsides. First is that proration is punishing low damage or incomplete builds. I was thinking about that a little bit. If you have a build that doesn't have all its pieces together, and you do a lot of like one of your damage abilities you've got, but you don't have the other one yet, you don't just not do that damage or not fit that into your rotation. It makes your other abilities actually objectively worse than they would have been otherwise, because you don't have you not only can't do something during a certain part of your rotation, you also can't undo the damage proration that you inflicted on the enemy to the damage type that you're doing. Right, very weird. A fully built character might be able to finish a fight before proration has time to kick in. Oh, that's not what okay. Also, the jump in power is really big, right? The character who cannot close out a fight quickly has their damage dwindle to relative nothing. Okay, this is an even more bad issue. A poor gets poorer situation. Given that Torum is free to play, but with microtransactions, yeah, not pulling the pin on that particular grenade. I would like to see another spin on rotating your damage types for best results elsewhere. Indeed, this is one where, just like the other ones we talked about, I don't think it's funny, I don't think there's any doubt that this is a pretty interesting idea that would be good, as long as you didn't mess it up, basically. But the problems are, yeah, I hate always saying obvious. You've made it sound obvious. you played a lot of the game and then worded it very well. Maybe that makes it sound obvious. I want to talk about that for a second because I think it's kind of the key to most game design analysis. I really insist that it probably is obvious, and it's just a matter of perspectives again. It's a matter of I think that people do not think these mechanics all the way through before development. I had a big conversation on the stream one time where I was trying to be very careful not to make it sound like I was not emphasizing playtesting, but trying to say that I think the developers over rely on playtesting for something that it's you would want to do even more playtesting to handle this issue, but they're relying on only a little playtesting to catch something that really it's good to just kind of project a little bit before the game starts. And I think this is because a lot of developers are not excited about game mechanics. Like, I think that's sort of weird, but maybe just a lot of larger game developers are not that excited about mechanics. Or maybe it's a logistical issue where when you have a large development team, there aren't that many people in charge of supposed to understand the mechanics, but thus most of the team really isn't excited about a thing that if it isn't good or coherent or well thought out, the whole game isn't going to be interesting to play. So it kind of doesn't matter to make this unless people understand what's going on, but that just isn't currently the workflow. To me, that seems like a actually fairly easy problem to solve if people would just accept that it is a problem, but that might not be what's wrong. So diagnosing this situation hard. Actually preventing these types of things from happening, I'm not sure that's that hard in some cases. We talk a lot about how in games like Limbus Company is an example we've often given. Limbus Company demonstrates a great flexibility with its designers. A lot of the game design ideas in Limbus Company are very open-ended, abstract, out of the box, thinking outside the box type of reactions to the game's, basic combat. They'll come up with ideas that are a very interesting creative use of the game's core combat, but not a very well planned out way of introducing those ideas, as if they came up with this core combat system but didn't just like stop for a minute and think, okay, but we need to make like 50 characters in this game for it to be successful. Way more than that, really. What are they gonna do? Or like if we run out, what are we gonna do? And it kind of feels like they just didn't do that at all. Or sort of like the first few updates for the first year of that game's lifespan, I feel like that was already an issue, where even if the game had been a total flop, which it's not, it's gone on to be very successful, that's great and all, but even before that would have been clear, like it would have run for no matter what for that period of time. Nobody expects to have their game be a smash hit, but you would have needed to know this no matter how well the game did, earlier than they seem to be having trouble with it. So I don't know, like that is a little strange to me. Again, you could posit various reasons why that might be the case. Me, I don't really get excited about anything in games that isn't the mechanics. And to be blunt, I don't really know why people do. I mean, if they play games a lot anyway. It's obvious why people get excited about things other than the game's mechanics when they don't play a lot of games. It's because those things are easier to understand. They're visible from the outside. But if you play games, I mean, it's a physical activity you do. Like, you have to perform the activity. Why not think, I mean, what happens if you build this mechanic in? Can the player actually use this mechanic in some way? Have we, the developers of the game, imagined playing this game ourselves and the very basic things we would need to know, like how much of this game warping mechanic is active or that a skill inflicts before we implement the mechanic? I hope you can agree that there is something going wrong in an unintuitive way with these types of mechanics where it's different than the pollution mechanic in some sense, because that pollution mechanic example, as you said, Mr. Food, it's entangled with a lot of other game systems where you could imagine that they might have uncovered problems with it and felt like there's a point at which this is your job, you're in deep in the game design, and you have to just accept that it is like that. And it was sufficiently difficult to understand that players will think to play this way. That being said, I think for a lot of these mechanics, there is a way of looking at it where it does feel obvious, though, where players will be cutthroat, and if you've been around the block in game design, you would know that. And so won't they use anything that affects other players negatively? I don't know, like one of the red flags for any multiplayer game is if the player can do a thing that is their decision, that it imposes something on other players. It's always something to think about. You know, simple examples like in Magic the Gathering, there are spells that are counter spells that make a spell not happen before it has even hit the table. Got a creature that you plan for your opponent to kill, it's got an ability where when it enters the battlefield, you get something right away. That way, if they machine gun it down with removal, if your opponent plays Magic, you still get something. But if that's counterspelled, you don't get the thing. There's a type of spell in the game that makes it so even the spells that account for your opponent interfering with you don't account for your opponent interfering with you. Is there something the player can do about that? Because one of the 5 colors of cards in the game, green, is all about big creatures. So if you don't have a way for them to deal with that, that's not going to work in a way that you do not need to have made the game yet to realize. You know, that should be obvious. I'm trying to unpack that a little bit. I was suggesting before that probably the solution here is that it is obvious, but the perspective required for it to be obvious is what is hard to get. Or another way I've often thought of it is to be a large-scale development team and spend enough time developing video games that you can make these games. That life then makes it difficult to have the perspective where it is then obvious that you should not do that thing. Maybe. I don't fully buy into that, but I'm trying to be open-minded about why it could be. I don't know, so maybe it's that, but that doesn't really make that much sense to me. Not yet, anyway. I guess I'll just have to find it out for myself, but that'll be in the future. And so I guess that is the thing here, where it kind of feels like this isn't even a matter of predicting what the problems with that mechanic will be. This is just the player doesn't know what that mechanic is. Now, of course, we can speculate that it might be because the developer is imagining that the player will just kind of feel out the consequences. It's a vibes thing of this mechanic, rather than specifically, so this is often seen as a bad thing, like obsessing over, oh, this mechanic enables this other mechanic. If I attack with this attack, it's making that attack stronger, but this attack weaker, and I want to know by how much so I can choose when to switch. I just feel like people are a bit allergic to that. It's related to the kind of allergic to math thing. I feel like developers think players are much more allergic to that than they actually probably are. And so maybe they thought, well, it's not that we're not including information you need. We're choosing not to obsess over minutia you don't need to know. And it's just that, no, not really. Like, that's not really the situation. This is just the core way to do damage in the game. And the players that aren't obsessing over that information are the players who need to know this, so they have an indicator showing them that they made their own damage type do less damage. I don't know. To me, that isn't complicated, but as we always say in my household, hire a psychologist for your game design. Anyway, or us? I don't know. I thought you did a good job explaining it. Some optional reading. Eye patch notes, which I will absolutely take you up on. Some multi-hit skills calculate proration per hit. For example, a rain of arrows might have each wave of arrows proc physical proration. Every instance of damage will deal progressively less physical damage, having been prorated by the previous wave, but each hit will make the next magic or normal attack deal more damage. Math for demonstration. Enemy has 100% proration for all damage types, so neutral. And again, the game does not show you this. You haven't damaged them yet, let's say. Say Arrow Rain hits 4 times at 10% proration. Arrow Rain will hit at 0% penalty, then minus 10%, minus 20%, and minus 30% on Rain Wave 4. At the end of the skill, the enemy now has 140% magic and normal proration. Go get the wizard to drop a meteor or something. Flip side is some skills calculating the damage once and then dividing the 1 damage packet equally across however many hits. This is great since the enemy can be set up to have a high proration value for the desired damage type. A target so tenderized can take a sudden spike of damage as proration is a potent multiplier by design. But which calculation is used for a given skill is not stated in game. There's a little heartbreak symbol emoji that I thought was heartbreaking to see. I believe that what you're implying by this is that there are some skills which it's not that the mere fact that a skill shows you a bunch of little hits instead of one big hit for its damage means that it is prorated a bunch of little hits instead of one big hit. There are skills that the game does not tell you have proration designed like their one hit, but they show you their damage like multiple hits. They're calculated like one hit, but they then show or divide that damage in practice among multiple hits, and they do not tell you this. I'm tempted to argue that at the very least, to be generous where possible, this is something that would be obvious if you were playing the game. You would see, oh, well, they all did the same damage, which wouldn't happen if it was prorated, unless the enemy's proration was fully, at the negative or positive bound, right? So maybe it's not obvious, actually. I cannot be generous about that. No, that still isn't obvious. And that still wouldn't make it, that's no excuse for not showing the player. I'm just saying, to be fair, maybe that doesn't seem as necessary, but no, it immediately does seem necessary. So unfortunately, yeah, no, that does still sound pretty bad. But you gave a great example of a skill where this is a really interesting setup. You can hit a lot of times, and one skill might prorate the enemy a lot, making them vulnerable to some big attack. You could imagine really chaining these things together. Rapid hit of one damage type, big single hit of another damage type, rapid hit of another damage type, big single hit of the first damage type, which is now unprorated, rapid hit of that damage type, big hit of the, and then you loop. And you could create some kind of complicated damage rotation like I was talking about earlier, where you get really the best of all worlds with the proration, and you can use each skill for kind of its own unique thing. This also provides opportunities for skills that can be powerful, but have the consequence of blowing through a lot of proration. I don't know if these exist in the game, but that would be a good thing about this design, so let's talk about it for a sec. For example, imagine that Arrow Rain does a lot of damage, like a lot, but prorates, I'm going to make it prorate 8 times instead at 10%. So this really nukes your physical damage proration. And that means that even though it's a lot of damage, it comes at the cost of needing to build up much more proration again later if you want to do damage with this skill effectively in the future. It also opens up the possibility that you can go forward using this skill not as a damage nuke anymore, because you already cashed in a larger than normal amount of physical damage proration, but you use that to get a big damage nuke, and now this skill still serves the purpose of allowing you to build up other proration types, but you're probably not going to be able to get your physical up easily again, or maybe some builds would try to do that. It's a cool idea. Again, this one is kind of undone by quality of life related stuff. I mean, I said at the beginning that I don't think we're going to find a common thread between these, and I think that was mostly true. That ended up being good, don't get me wrong. You folks presented 3 really different kinds of examples of janky mechanics. Janky and like bad to different degrees, and preventable to different degrees, and with their own complications to different degrees, and janky for different reasons. But I do think there is a common thread, which is that they're all kind of things that are hard to see. Not an intentional joke about Just Rusty's Hyperdemon example, but they're things that are like a little hidden on the surface. There is an element of abstract thinking, and I don't want to be too hand-wavy about, oh, it's obvious if you just think in all of these ultra-specific ways that require practice to think. Like, I'm only arguing that I do think that's the job of a game designer, to try to think that way. But I'm not trying to say that it's not hard at all. I think what's fair to say is that I don't know how hard it is to think that way, because I just do. And we'll have to see if I'm able to enact that in my own game design. I think it's pretty easy. I don't see why I would have difficulty noticing these things, so let's try it. But the human mind has a great blind spot for things that have come up over and over again, and these are what I would describe as kind of not quiet, really, but sort of second nature-y mechanics, where it's something a little bit in the background of the system for Mr. Fruit's game, I'm forgetting the name, Humankind. A little bit in the background, a cost, a side effect to developing some systems. The example with iPatch Notes and Torab Online, this is an example of something that, I mean, it's not even shown in the game. Like, some people would not fully notice, or they would read it on a skill, and it would be small enough of presence in the game that they would say, I don't know, I'll figure it out later. But in fact, it's actually on all skills, and they've been suffering the consequences the whole time. So I don't know, it's like it has that blind spot thing where if it's just been in the game the whole time or you got used to it, like the behind your eyes vision and Hyperdemon, then that becomes a blind spot. But then on top of that, it's also, it's very difficult to, if you play Hyperdemon and somehow undo that ability, the whole game changes. You can't easily kind of go back to what it's like to not be able to see enemies in the back of your head. You could turn that feature off and do some dev testing, but I don't think that would accurately simulate that feeling. And for these other systems, it's part and parcel of the game's design. So it's very easy to just kind of take as a given as a designer. That system's just kind of there at the, I guess I'm trying to say, sort of at the baseline of the game's design. So maybe that's why I ended up turning this into an exploration of, yeah, I feel like these mechanics could work. So why don't they? And speculating hopefully beyond, I felt like I went beyond the usual complaint I have, which is that it's hard not to feel like these are obvious mistakes to make from the outside. To say, well, but they do have a unique way in which they become a sort of a blind spot, don't they? Now, I'm still tempted to argue that if you go into the design and your goal on Earth is to not get blindsided by this kind of problem, I feel like you can do it. I don't think that's that weird, but it's just that people don't do that. I mean, after all, because the mechanic isn't really visible in any of the game's marketing or any casual player's experience, although in Humankind it probably is visible in the casual experience. Hyperdemon, it's literally visible in the casual player's experience, but that game might not even have that many casual players. It probably feels like it needs to be less of a priority. And I can see this all being, oh, the designers know all of this stuff, but it just was forcibly deprioritized. And so to make a game that doesn't do this, it is obvious, but you just need to really ram through prioritizing that thing in design. That could be what it is too. Because these are all very quiet things, it's tempting to say, well, can't the player just learn to vary their damage types? It's like, I'll leave you with one thing that for these kinds of mechanics and when they're janky or there are issues that has come up a lot recently. I've found that when you bring up that you don't think a mechanic is as good as it could be, people have a tendency to say something like, oh, but it's not that bad. And it's like, right, it's not, maybe. But that doesn't matter. We're talking about how we can get a big benefit for not very much effort. And that's why these things are often so valuable, because many of them can be tuned. It might be hard to balance them, but you can relatively easily balance them out. You can change a slider or a number to adjust them in some way. And often these are mechanics that are in games that are otherwise pretty cool. And so you could kind of unlock or free a lot of game design from those consequences for very little benefit. It's almost because there is no need that it is worth having this discussion in many cases. I was reminded of in Genshin Impact, we were talking about the design implications of like doing buffs. That's something they quite famously haven't done. They don't really change characters practically at all after release. And indeed, I think in the grand scheme of game design, they do a much better than average job of balancing those characters. They have to because they aren't willing to change them after release, but okay. Now, it would be really easy to improve a lot of them in simple ways, not even having to do with balance. Things like wording or mechanical technology that has been added to future characters, but that launch characters or older characters just kind of didn't get the benefit of. Just updating them, not even really changing their in practice functionality that much, but just updating them with those things. That would be a big difference. But they have thus far refused to do that. And we said that we were a few of us. I Petronas, I believe you as well. So I say we. We're talking about how it would be really great to see that in Genshin Impact. And somebody responded and said, the balance is pretty good though. And I that was really useful to hear. Right. But I wasn't thinking, it doesn't matter. Like I wasn't thinking about that at all. You're right. I thought to myself, I hope I said to them. But that's not the point in the first place, in my mind. The entirety of the issue is that the game has a lot of good, very close to being accessible, if only they would do this relatively small, sort of change to kind of wake up or unlock that design. And I feel like people tend to argue that they're saying there's no fire. And I say, right, but that doesn't mean fire safety is bad. Or you've gotten used to, fire drills here, but that doesn't mean we should stop doing them for new people. it's still a good thing to do. Another example is a friend was complaining about how Tears of the Kingdom, Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, has a quick build feature that lets you not have to manually build something every single time that you've built before. Extremely core to the game experience, in my opinion, but it's behind an optional and like kind of weirdly placed boss, not really tutorialized. I haven't played through that part of Tears of the Kingdom, so I take their word. Let's just use that as an example. If that wasn't your experience, I don't know. The point is, for a lot of people, they're thinking, well, you can just look that up. You can just know that. And it's like, well, you can, but that's not an argument that changing this wouldn't be good. You're just arguing that there's no emergency or something, and like there isn't. You're right. That's not the topic of discussion. There's whatever, I suppose. But I mean, life is whatever. Nothing is anything. I'm trying to say that this would make things a lot better, not making a comment about how good or bad they currently are. I don't care, really. There's only improving it by more, I would say. And so for many of these games, the argument is more, yeah, it doesn't need fixing. That's why it's a good idea to try to make the improvements. So I know that's not really the topic of this parlay, but I think it's interesting because a lot of these mechanics fall into that bucket where tweaking them is even more clearly worthwhile because it's a good idea, most of them. Or like Hyperdemon, having the training mode is a nice, accessible thing to include in the game. That it might seem like, well, but are people really, like the kind of person who will enjoy this will be the kind of person to be self-motivated and just figure it out, probably. But I mean, for one thing, you don't know. Nobody ever knows. There's only knowing that you don't know exactly who the audience of the game will be. And it's certainly true that it will improve the number of people who enjoy Hyperdemon to include a tutorial. So having the conversation be about how much it's needed, I mean, you can't know how much it's needed. What is how much it's needed? No, nothing is needed. Gestures to the universe, It's more, okay, but it would be a big benefit to the game. Whatever that benefit is relative to, whatever, we've decided to make this game. And the cost of making that, adding in that benefit is, in many cases, not that large, relatively small compared to other things you could do. And that, I feel like, is the argument. Whereas I feel like a lot of people tend to reject these kinds of things on the grounds that it just isn't that bad. And it's like, okay, but it's worse by a lot and could be made better for not much. It is more the thing. And speaking of that topic, I am looking forward to having a crew parlay with you all next month that is about that, basically. A little bit more of that idea. This was from doing the first read through of these. I thought, wouldn't it be fun to do a little discussion about cases where, yeah, like this is a property or a mechanic that would be fun, but there's something kind of like one tiny change that, if made, would sort of blow it all open. Quite different than this topic in practice, because for many of these things, the whole thing is it's kind of interesting how hard it would be to fix it, or even in cases where it's probably not, like, technically speaking that hard to fix, like just putting it in the darn UI in the Torum Online example with the damage attenuation. It's like you would need to change a lot of the game. It sounds like a lot of skill descriptions just don't have it. And that's not even to mention the consequences potentially when you show the players that information and they then start using it because they know it's there, which might cause the game's balance in practice to change surprisingly a lot from what it was. So I think it'll be very different in practice. These are kind of keystone game design problems where there's something about the mechanic that is kind of keeping it away from being what it could be, and then it sort of opens up if you make one small change. I have some examples of my own. It doesn't have to be that the mechanic is bad. It could be that it would be transformative to do something new. And I hope that you'll join me for that one as well. So thanks for submitting stuff, folks. If you want to join us for Crew Parlay, well, a lot of you listening already can. This is a $5 tier perk, and I offer that tier on Twitch, YouTube members, and Patreon. So, for example, if you're a Twitch subscriber already, or you have Amazon Prime, so you have Twitch Prime, and you can give that sub to me if you want to. I treat that as my $5 tier. So a lot of you listening already have this. So if you would like to weigh in on those mechanics, anytime in April, you can respond to that prompt on the Discord. If you need my help finding it, just private message me on that Discord server and I'll help you figure it out. But if your accounts are connected, it should pop right up. Just go to the Crew Parley channel and weigh in, and I'm looking forward to going through a bunch of them next month. Again, I've got one kind of a pet example of my own for that subject, so I'm looking forward to talking about it then. For now, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for joining us for Crew Parley again. Looking forward to next month's. And if you want to get normal Parley, you want to do a whole length one, you don't want to share, or you want to share, you get Crew Parley access too, but you just want to do your own whole Parley, a full length one that is just about your prompt. You can get that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you. For now, I'll say see you in the next one.